Okay. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Welcome to the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And today we're discussing Russian soft power in France. Joining us is Marlene Laruelle, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council and research professor and associate director at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. It is a mouthful, so I had to look down, forgive me. And to my right, we're also joined by Jean-Yves Camus, who's a political analyst and associate research fellow at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us, and we have the two experts in the field. So let me start to launch us. Last month, President Emmanuel Macron visited Russia. And so this is a way to launch our conversation since we'll be discussing the various layers of the Franco-Russian relationship. Professor Laruelle, I want to start with you. What are the kind of structural components of the Franco-Russian relationship? And this is going back a long time, so we're talking Charles de Gaulle, right?
Exactly, yeah. Well, let me just begin by saying that this question of the Russian influence in Europe tends to be very often inflated or very hyped because it's a very sensitive topic in the US. And so what we try to do in the research that we have been doing here at the Carnegie Council was to try to be a little bit more sober and less emotional and look more in detail on the nature of the Russian influence and especially Russian soft power in the case of France. And that's true that it's really important to realize how much both countries have a very long relationship and a quite good relationship historically. Of course, not if you remember Napoleonic Wars, but it was really a long time ago. But since then, the relationship have been quite good, contrary to some other European countries. Cultural relations are very much developed. There is really a lot of things in Russia about French culture and in France about Russian culture. Economic exchanges are also very much developed, and a lot of big French firms in very strategic sectors like high-tech and the kind of military industrial complex are involved in Russia. So you have a lot of objective factors to explain why it's really important for Russia to be sure that it's securing connection with the different layers of the French society and the different French political parties. So just to try to put that in a kind of objective framework of relations and influences. And that's true, Magali, as you mentioned, there are several layers of influence, kind of structural one. And what I think is one of the central one is the legacy of de Gaulle and Gaullism, which is still quite important in the French political culture, both on the right and on the left. And that's what is interesting, is that it's kind of cross-political spectrum. So there is still this notion that, in fact, France and Russia shared a lot of kind of common geopolitical interest. De Gaulle always thought that Russia was part of Europe. He was always cautious toward the US, toward transatlantic institution. You remember that it's during his time that French left NATO integrated military command. He was always kind of praising this eternal Russia. So there is this tradition in the French globally political culture to be kind of distrustful toward the US and the transatlantic relationship, and to consider that there is something that makes Russia a legitimate actor on the European scene. So that's a very kind of general framework. Another structural element, which is in fact linked also to this legacy of Gaullism, is the notion of sovereignism, so sovereignism, which is also something that is shared both on the right and the left of the French political landscape, maybe more on the right one than on the left, but still. And that's this notion that this belief that the nation state is still the main and the best framework for expressing democracy and strategic national interest. And so there is this kind of distrust toward European institutions, this narrative that Brussels is kind of imposing its political choices and economic choices on nation state, and also denunciation of multilateral institutions, and all this kind of sovereignism of the nation state that is very visible in the French political culture. It's totally in resonance with Putin's narrative and Russia's geopolitical positioning about the sovereignty of the nation state against the so-called Western liberal order. So that's also a layer where there are some kind of ideological connection. And a third important element that I think we tend to not really to realize, and even I think for us it was really interesting during the research to realize that, is that both France and Russia see themselves historically, that's also kind of long history, as protecting Eastern Christian in the Middle East. And that's something that in France is coming from the 17th century already, and of course in Russia it has always been very present because of the Orthodox legacy, because Russia sees itself as heir of Byzance. On the French side, it's also because, well, you have French colonial past in the Middle East, in Lebanon, for example, very deep kind of long-term historical and cultural relations. There are a lot of Eastern Christians who are now living in France. So what is really interesting is that since the Syrian war and the Islamic State violence against Eastern Christian, there have been this kind of confluence of French and Russian interest in promoting or safeguarding, rescuing Eastern Christian in the Middle East. And thanks to that kind of ideological connection, there have been several lobbies or groups or networks or groups of influence that both inside the Russian state and society and in France, mostly among Catholic groups, so mostly on the right side of the political spectrum, that have been saying, well, both France and Russia share some joint geopolitical interest in the Middle East. And so all these kind of Catholic groups in France, and very often also several Lebanese associations, have been kind of pushing in promoting a quite favorable narrative about Russia. So that's the kind of three elements that I think as kind of pushing for some political affinities between some part of the French political landscape and the Russia one that are quite specific to France and that you don't find in the other European countries. So each of them having really a specific vision of their relationship to Russia.
So it's interesting to hear about this synergy, which I'm going to ask you, Mr. Camus. I want to touch on the topic of the far right, because it seems as though Russia has become the, as titled in one of the papers, the promised land of the French far right. And if so, why? How? Explain that.
First of all, I think that the extreme right has always been very interested in the capacity of the Russian people to maintain their traditions. And I would say the specificities of Russian culture, even at the times of the Soviet Union. There's this feeling on the extreme right that the Russian people is really so strong that they have succeeded in keeping their faith, their Christian faith, and in retaining many of their customs in spite of communism. And the extreme right is very impressed by the capacity of the Russian people to stay true to the traditions of the West, while they say at the same time that Western Europe is in a state of decay. So they mostly oppose Russia as the driving force that succeeds in keeping the Western values alive. And at the same time, the extreme right is describing France and other Western countries as countries with no future, no hope of retaining this past and those customs.
Tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's the first reason why they I would say,
they're comfortable.
Are at least comfortable with Russia. It's not a matter of Putin or not Putin. It's about the Russian people. And in a forthcoming book, I will have an article about those French volunteers who fought alongside the Nazis in Russia and what is now Belarus during the Second World War. So you had thousands of French volunteers fighting alongside the Germans against the USSR. And some of them spent 2.5, 3 years on the Eastern Front fighting the communists and fighting the Red Army. And they left a lot of books of souvenirs, memoir. And what is really interesting, what I've tried to describe in this article, in that at the same time they were fighting the Red Army, and they really hated communism. And the reason why they enlisted was this hatred of communism. But they came to know the Russian people, those, I would say, average Russian people living in the small villages. And they were very impressed by the fact that for most of those villagers, why it was like the Russian Revolution did not abolish anything except private property. They still clung to the old values. And so they were some kind of fascinated by the Russian people. The second point is that, especially after 1945, the French extreme right, as in many other countries, very much despised everything American, because America was associated with the defeat of the Axis, the defeat of the Vichy regime, and I mean, it's also kind of a hatred against America, and what the extreme right says is the end of, in some way, the end of Western civilization. So when you hate America, and it's the Cold War era, you cannot support the USSR, of course, because you belong to the extreme right, so you're also very anti-communist. But when the USSR collapses, obviously, your opinion can change quite quickly. The extreme right in all countries in Europe very much stands against any kind of unilateral order in international relations. So they stand...
They stand against any kind of unilateral...
Yes, against NATO in the United States being the only power in the world with the military capacity to tell the French or Italian or other people what to do. So starting not in the years immediately following the collapse of the USSR, because obviously Yeltsin was not their man, but as soon as Vladimir Putin became president, both the style of the man and the fact that Russia became some kind of a counterpower to NATO and America was met with, I would say, some feeling of revenge on everything that happened at the end of the Second World War.
Going all the way back there, that was still...
Going all the way back there, because many people, not the voters, but those activists on the extreme right, really belong to a tradition that sometimes is passed on from generation to generation. So maybe their grandparents had something to do with one or another political party of extreme right in the 1930s or 1940s, and they were raised in this state of mind that, the so-called liberation was in fact the end of the world.
So that was sort of like a turning point.
That was a turning point, but what I want to really
emphasize
say is that obviously the reason why the extreme right supports Vladimir Putin and the regime in Russia is not because of money. Money is something very important, and when the National Front, for example, gets money from a Russian bank in order to finance their political campaigns, of course, money is important. But why would the Russian give money to a political party polling around 20% if it were not for ideas? And I mean, it goes both ways. The Russian state certainly believes that today the National Front is the closest to the kind of political model they think is fit, both for Russia and for Europe. And on the other hand, not only does the French National Front is happy about receiving money, of course, but they also think that the model of Russia is something that they should adapt to Western Europe in terms of family values, strong leadership, opposition to Islamism, opposition to America, opposition to NATO, patriotism, and so on. So it's mostly about ideas, and it's because they have common ideas that the money can flow, not the other way around.
I see. So those are very interesting points. I want to touch, Professor Laruelle, with France's long tradition of having Russian immigrants, having Russian citizens or descendants living in France as part of the tradition. You even say that in one of your papers that Russian was taught in elementary school until very recently in French schools. But does the presence of the Russian population play an important role in shaping the Franco-Russian relationship?
Yeah, that's the immigration and the children of immigration really play an important role in connecting France to Russia, and they also play a role in what Jean-Yves just described, also in this kind of ideological resonance that is created between some part of the French political spectrum and Russia. So you know that there were like hundreds of thousands of Russian émigrés fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution all over Europe, and the group going to Paris, and not only to Paris, to several other regions in France, was quite important. And so they settled, they really played an important role in the French cultural life all over the 20th century. And that's interesting to see how they progressively begin playing this role of mediating between France and Russia, and we can see that at different levels. First, we see that all the diaspora association, the Russian Diaspora Association, have been partly retaken control by Moscow. At the beginning, of course, they were totally independent, and as Jean-Yves said, they were like the French far right. They were very anti-communist by definition because they fled the country. But in the 2000s, like 10 years ago, once Putin arrived in power and began kind of courting the diaspora, it really played a role, and Russia began funding a lot of this Russian association under the notion that they all belong to this Russian world, which is one of the big theme of the regime in Moscow. So this association began really playing a role of representing, in a sense, Russia's perception with their own nuances and differences. And there are some associations that are really resisting also Moscow's influence, that don't want that really kind of say, we are coming from this immigration, we are not linked to what is happening now in Russia. So there are some room of maneuver, but let's say that globally they became more connected to Moscow. And among all these associations, we also have this tradition of having quite visible Russian aristocratic families playing really a role in the French cultural landscape.
It's more accepted there.
Who are very well integrated in the French system, and that who got also courted by the Russian regime. And so several of these aristocratic families were kind of given symbolic recognition by chairing some cultural associations that are funded by Russia. And so one of the good examples we had is that in 2014, during the Ukrainian crisis, so after Russia's annexation of Crimea and the insurgency in Donbass and all the tensions between Russia and Europe, there was a petition signed by 100 big names of the Russian immigration in France called the Russian Bridge, and trying to kind of defend the Russian perspective against the Ukrainian one, and trying to lobby for this Russian perception of the conflict in the French political landscape. So that's where we could really see them as, in that case, instrument of the regime. And then they also play an interesting role because they are very well connected to French businesses and big firms that are working in Russia. I think it's really important to realize that almost all the big French firms, those who are part of what we call CAC 40, which is the French benchmark stock exchange market index. So all the big French firms, they are involved in Russia. They have businesses in Russia. And very often the children of émigrés are sometimes playing an important role in making the connection between politics, business, and Russia. And so they are, for example, one of the main kind of lobbying association called the Dialogue Franco-Russe, the Franco-Russian dialogue, was led until recently by children of a Russian émigré who really had really impressive connection to some political party, but also to the business world. Something also that we have, which is coming from this immigration, is that there are two very quite powerful Orthodox charity foundations that are very active in France, both of them led by some oligarchs very close to Putin, one led by Vladimir Yakunin, who was the head of the Russian railways until 2015, and a very close friend of Putin, and the other by Konstantin Malofeyev, who is a communication business oligarch. Very monarchist, openly funding the insurgency in Donbass. And so both these Orthodox charity foundations are quite active in France. They have Russian émigrés as part of their board. Some of them are promoting this Russian narrative of conservative values, Russia as the savior of the Christian identity of Europe. So they are quite visible. And linked to that, and that will be my last point, the Russian Orthodox Church is also quite active in France. First, because they try to retake over all the Orthodox churches and parishes that were belonging to the Russian immigration and to the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. So there was, during at least a decade, several fights and really with legal proceedings by the Moscow Patriarchate trying to retake control over the Orthodox churches in France. Sometimes they failed, sometimes they succeeded. For example, the big Orthodox cathedral in Nice in the south of France got retaken by the Moscow Patriarchate.
Because it was held by the
It was belonging to the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. That was either independent or under the Constantinople Patriarchate.
I see.
Yeah.
And they succeeded in Nice.
They succeeded in Nice, they failed in Biarritz, so depending on each case was quite specific. And since the mid-2000s, there was this kind of big project organized by the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church to build the biggest Orthodox cathedral in Europe, in Paris, in a very central neighborhood. It created a lot of discussion in France, and it succeeded, it worked, and so the Orthodox cathedral got inaugurated in 2016 by the Patriarch himself. Putin was planned to come, but he didn't come at the end. It was a moment of tension between France and Russia over Syria. So it was a huge diplomatic success for France and really a sign of Russia's kind of soft power in the region. And that, I think, it's clearly showing how much from the Russian perspective, Paris, because it's symbolically important and because of the Russian immigration past, is really a place where Moscow wants to kind of display its soft power. At the same time, I think we also need to be quite kind of do some comparison. In Germany, you have about 4 million Russian émigrés, not coming from the Russian immigration, the white historical immigration, but more kind of recent émigrés. So it's a much more bigger immigration, a much more really important.
What is the population in France, though, of Russia, approximately?
It's few 100,000 maximum, and they are French citizens now. So now it's 50,000 people that have the Russian passport. But this one are new people who arrived recently. That's not the children of the immigration. While Germany received really a lot of Russian speakers these last 2 decades, and they are also very much active in promoting the Russian perspective in Germany. So in a sense, Germany is facing also another kind of lobbying coming from Moscow through this immigration.
And so while they're all coming, the UK is kicking them out after.
Well, the UK had a policy of welcoming Russian money and Russian oligarchs for decades, and since the Skripal poisoning affair, they are pushing them away.
You were talking about the Front National, the extreme right, the presence in Russia. But what about other mainstream French political parties? Do they have a presence or a role in Russia? A relationship?
They have a relationship with Russia because, as Marlene said, we have this tradition of Gaullism, the ideology of national independence from American NATO, promoted by the President of France between 1958 and 1969. And the mainstream conservative right is still, at least nominally, in the tradition of de Gaulle. So the mainstream political parties, especially the main party on the conservative right, Les Républicains, has always been very close to Russia, and Nicolas Sarkozy used to be close to Russia. His prime minister, François Fillon, who was the unsuccessful candidate for the presidency in 2017, were very positive about Russia. But on the other hand, I feel that in Moscow, many people felt that in some ways this Gaullist tradition was going to vanish, to fade away as time is passing. And the legacy of Gaullism is something the young generation does not know. And even Sarkozy was seen, especially after he came to the United States and was so enthusiastic with the United States, he was seen as an illegitimate heir to de Gaulle, leaning much more towards NATO because he decided to go back into the NATO military command. So I think that this was a turning point because certainly at that time in Moscow, some people said, okay, in the next decades, what will be the most important political party on the right? Will it still be the mainstream conservative right or the National Front? So possibly it will be the National Front. And anyway, the mainstream conservative right is moving more towards European integration, towards America. So we have to keep a balance and keep France with both sides of the right. But the mainstream conservative right is, I would say, historically quite close to Russia.
So I'm going to, before we turn it to the audience for questions, I have to ask, and you can both answer this. In the mainstream news media here, Russia seems to be a topic, a daily topic, in some form or another. We're not getting into details, but the equivalent in France, is it talked about in the news? Is it part of the daily conversation? Do French people care?
No. So honestly, it's really, I mean, the comparison is really not a functional one because there is no this feeling in France. You see, the specificity of the US is also the obsession, the actual US obsession toward Russia is also because Russia is seen as a kind of, constitutive other for the US, the kind of archetypical enemy. And then Russia is projecting the same things on the US. In France, it doesn't exist like that. We don't see Russia as the kind of enemy,
right?
In theory of France. Then there is no, so we don't have any kind of energy dependency linked to Russia, which is a big difference from several other countries which are dependent in terms of their energy resources from Russia. So Russia is not a kind of big issue of, death of life in France. There is no big Ukrainian minority, so the Ukrainian issue is there, but not so much. Mm-hmm. So it's much less present than it would be in Germany or in Poland. So Russia is kind of far away. It's discussed when there is something big happening, but there is not this kind of obsession. There are some discussion when something happened, and of course when there was the campaign and then Macron election, right. There was some discussion about possible Russian influence, and then Jean-Yves can probably say something about that. But for example, when Russia Today, the state-sponsored channel, opened their French-speaking channel late December, there was some discussion the week it was launched, and then nothing else, because it's not so important. The real French political landscape is either discussing domestic issues or discussing Middle East, because by tradition, that's also where the French foreign policy is really focused, right. Is discussing European construction, difficulties in it, and the Middle East. And then Russia is quite far away. Jean, would you agree with that?
Totally. Yeah. We had Russia in the news every evening for 2 weeks before the presidential election because Russia Today or Sputnik had some leaks about the Macron campaign. but it faded away very quickly because you have to realize that Macron was elected with 66% of the vote, and Marine Le Pen only got 33% of the vote. So anyway, if the Russians try to influence the French election, they failed.
They did fail. Yeah.
No, they failed totally. So, and I think they didn't really play a significant role. On the other hand, what is the major problem in France today? Is it Russia meddling into the elections? No. Even in terms of soft power, since we had those terror attacks in 2015, and we had another one in 2016 as well, we have a problem with the soft power of Qatar, of Saudi Arabia, the soft power of the non-governmental Islamic organizations, and we are much more concerned with those topics than we are with the influence of Russia. And anyway, we are a country located in Western Europe. We have, as Marlene said, a very long tradition of good relations with Russia, going back to the first embassy of Peter I back, 300 years ago. And so there is an historical legacy that you simply just cannot ignore and say, oh, Russia is the enemy and we have to cut off ties. No way. We do not only have those big French companies making business with Russia, but anyway, in terms of diplomacy, I think that Macron believes that it's never good to tell a country you do not agree with, okay, we'll just cut off ties. And that is not diplomacy. So when our president went to the St. Petersburg summit 2 weeks ago, he was very outspoken on his opposition to some of Putin's policy, but he wants to keep cooperation going, and he wants to keep some kind of channel with the Kremlin, and he's also, as the first president since the beginning of the civil war in Syria, to say something that Putin agrees with. And Macron says, peace in Syria is only possible if you include Assad in the deal. François Hollande, our previous president, said...
You have to include Assad in the deal.
Yes, François Hollande used to say, Assad has to go, and then we will work on a solution to the Syrian crisis. No way, you cannot do that. And Macron says, Assad is part of the picture, is part of the negotiation, and of course, he very strongly condemns his war crimes, but at the same time, he has a much more realistic approach.
Because it leaves a vacuum if he goes too. So are there any questions in the audience? Please. We have a few here. And there are microphones available. Here we go. You can go on the other side too if you want. That way we'll share. Please.
Bonsoir. We have an interesting president also, as you're well aware. And President Trump was just at the Group of Seven. And one of the things he proposed on his own volition is to add Russia, or to bring Russia back to be Group 8. What do you think about this? You know, from the European viewpoint, where these trade negotiations and other relations are so important?
Well, that kind of echoes what Macron was saying about. Did you hear the question? Qu'est-ce qu'on pense que Trump invite la Russie à revenir au G8, au G7, enfin, que ça redevienne le G8?
I think that from the answer from the French authorities is quite positive.
Yeah, I think, you see, the point is that Trump is changing the rule of the game, of the diplomatic game, so much that in a sense it's also giving some room for Russia to appear like a normal country with whom you can play and have some diplomatic discussion, not over Ukraine, of course, where it's quite frozen, difficult over Syria, but going on. But on any kind of other multilateral trade discussion, then given the difficulty that Trump is creating in having his own position, it seems suddenly for some part of the political spectrum that you can discuss more easily with Putin on some aspect that you can with Trump. And so I think there is this kind of paradox of Trump having this kind of provocative statement, quite positive to Russia, but his own action by what is kind of destroying of what is considered as the traditional Western liberal order is also giving room for Russia to act and to display some kind of, acting in according to some rules of the game. So it's a quite complex.
The main problem of the French authorities today with President Trump is not over Russia; it's over trade negotiations and everything that is negative, especially for the steel industry
and the Iranian nuclear deal.
And the Iranian nuclear
Russia, because of Trump's position, Russia looks like a very reliable partner who still wants to continue and rescue the Iranian nuclear deal. So that's why you can feel this kind of partly changing atmosphere in Europe toward Russia. But it's also not solving anything on the ground in terms of Minsk agreements for Donbass and so on. So it's still quite complicated. But there are suddenly kind of new rule of the game that seems to be appearing.
Merci.
Please.
Thank you to both speakers for the very interesting talk. So my question is, the French far right has usually been aligned with the Russian far right, and with Dugan as a main exponent of that thought. And we also know that Russia has been sometimes agreeing with Dugan on some of his policy lines, but recently has been distancing itself from it. So my question is the French far right still more close to Dugan or to Putin?
If we begin and say Dugan.
So let me begin, and then Jean-Yves will follow. So for those of you who don't know, Alexander Dugin was of the main kind of very vocal Russian intellectual, new right / fascist, depending how you want to define him, who has been one of the first in developing connection with the European far right. So that to explain the question. I think it's quite complicated. Dugin always had deep connection with some section of the European far right, French, Belgian, Italian, before all, and before German or Scandinavian. But it was always small, specific kind of quite intellectual group that we call the New Right. He never had huge, big connection with the National Front, for example, because he was always kind of too esoterical for them. So when the National Front really developed connection with Russia, it was at a much more official level than with Dugin himself. So Dugin is still there. He has his own network. Sometimes he can benefit for the current wave of connection, for example, through Malofeyev, this oligarchs, so who is trying to push for a kind of monarchist agenda. So Dugin can play on that, while Malofeyev is also a kind of para-diplomatic figure. But the connection that the Russian establishment had with some European far-right party is much more official, and it's not really based on Dugin. It has other kind of channel of communication. Would you?
I totally agree. I happened to have lunch with Alexander Dugin several years ago, and it was a very interesting experience because, he has very good command of French and of French philosophy to some point. But at one stage in the conversation, he goes into this kind of esotericism, which is not easily understood and is not relevant to a political party such as the National Front. When he is into geopolitics, that can be of some interest. But at one point, he goes into something which is his own esotericism, and his own philosophy and references to very unknown and obscure writers and thinkers, and except on the very fringe of the extreme right, it's very difficult to agree with them. And even within the New Right, I happen to have attended one of the last conferences of the New Right, and Dugan, well, he wasn't there because it seems that he was denied entry. But he spoke on satellite, with a satellite link. And, well, people in the attendance were not so happy with what he said, because that was in December 2016. And he was so positive about the election of Donald Trump that the New Right people, who really are anti-American from the start, said, oh, what happened? Here is Dugan praising President Trump. Anyway, Trump is the President of the United States, and nothing good can come out of the United States. So, no, really. And I think that he has lost ground.
And yeah, also something that I think is important to realize that, so the French National Front was the first far-right party to develop this level of connection with some part of the Russian establishment. At the same time, if you look now that Marine Le Pen lost, and lost in a very visible manner in the election last year, Russia has really been developing connection with other parties. So it's no more France that is at the center of Russia's attention now in terms of building kind of institutional links with European far-right parties. It's Lega Nord in Germany, in Italy. It's FPO in Austria. So that the two one with whom the presidential party, United Russia, signed an agreement of cooperation with this far-right party. And in another little bit less lower level, it's Alternative for Germany. So that's...
What I also want to add briefly is that the French extreme right is split between a majority of pro-Russian people and a minority of pro-Ukrainian people. Let's not forget that some of those fellows show a totally different path and chose to support the most radical nationalist parties in the Ukraine. So you have people from the French extreme right fighting in the Donbass alongside the pro-Russian militia, but you also have people from the French extreme right fighting with the Ukrainians in the infamous Azov unit, and which today is part of the National Guard of Ukraine. So it's not a one-sided story.
Many layers. One more question, please.
Merci beaucoup. My question for you is, from
Could you
what
come
I
closer to the microphone? Sorry.
From what I understand, you're saying that there is a concrete interest for Macron and also for France to have somewhat of a close relationship with Russia, and that they're able to work on many things. I think many NATO watchers and many Russia watchers, at least from an American perspective, have seen France as one of the strongest NATO partners, especially in relation to Russia, especially since Macron has come into power. Say Trump is no longer the president in a few years, that he's a four-year president. Do you think that Macron, or even just France in general, will be, if there's a change in policy in the US that is more anti-Russia, do you think that Macron or France will be with the US in that policy, or perhaps, maybe they have a closer relationship, or take more of a German approach to it?
Or maintain what they have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, in fact, the two are quite dissociated. I think the French relations with the US is not a bad one. There are some points of tension that have been recently created with the trade negotiation and the Iranian nuclear deal. But look on Syria, Macron was really kind of following the US on many aspects in the perception of the Syrian crisis. So I think the two things are not related, but my impression is that the French vision of Russia will not change, And if the US became more anti-Russia than now, I don't know if it's possible, but look, for example, the last sanctions, US sanctions on Russia were not followed by Europe, and were really interpreted in Europe as being, in fact, targeting also European firms doing business with Russia. And that was really perceived on the European or the French perspective as being not something friendly toward Europe, not friendly toward Russia for sure, but also not friendly toward Europe. So I think the French interest, because of the long relationship because of trade, because of cultural links, because of also the agriculture, you know, the French agriculture got really armed by the Russian counter-sanction on forbidding all the agricultural products from Europe. So there are many elements that would push France to be quite moderate and nuanced and always try to keep the channel of communication with Russia open and try to maintain something with Russia. Because you see also what seems to me one of the big issues is that when you see Russia from the European continent, well, we are on the same continent. There is no way. We cannot be dissociated by geography. We will have to find a way to function with Russia in one way or another. So I think the French perspective is always try to be loyal to NATO commitment and transatlantic institution, but also to keep certain level of autonomy in defining what should be a European perception of Russia that will not be a US one. So
autonomy is the key word in French foreign policy for several decades, and it will go on this way, I think.
I just want to clarify, I didn't mean break relations with Russia, just a stronger policy vis-a-vis Russia. That's all.
I don't think the French policy toward Russia can be stronger than what it is already. I mean, it's the sanction on Crimea and on Donbass. What else? France will not follow the US on the last round of sanctions. I don't think so. France expelled 4 diplomats after the Skripal poisoning affair. So France followed the kind of the general mainstream of being tougher on Russia, but no more than that seems to me difficult given the current context.
It's very difficult, especially since the French oil industry has a lot of contracts going on with Russia, and the French manufacturers of planes and weapons also have a lot of deals going on with Russia. So it's just not possible to cut off ties. So Macron also has a goal, and his goal is to be, I would say, not the head of the EU, because, as you know, the European Commission is not elected. But at this time, he is the strongest head of state in the whole of Western Europe. Merkel is obviously not that strong anymore. Italy is just
collapsing.
No, I do not think they have collapsed, but I mean they're following a path that's really hard to understand. Spain has just switched from a conservative to a socialist-led majority, and so on and so forth. So Macron is the only head of state in Europe who can say, I've been elected by 63% of the people, and I'm only 40 years old, and I'm legitimate enough to be the one who wants to carry a common European position vis-a-vis not only Russia, but also vis-a-vis the United States or any any other country. So it will also depend on what Macron will do on the European level.
Thank you.
And if I can just add on just one small, I think, for example, the current debates about Germany signing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So if it's done, it means that Russian energy will go directly to Germany and will not transit anymore by Ukraine, which would really weaken the Ukrainian position for a very long time and really hurt Ukraine a lot. Germany seems to be ready to sign, and Merkel was quite positive about signing. Macron said he thought it was a bad idea and that would be better not to sign. So on that, he has a tougher position than Merkel. But the point is that the US perception of Russia cannot be replicated in Europe because it's a too tough one for Europe. Because US can afford to cut economic links with Russia because very few US businesses will be hurt. I mean, Boeing will be hurt, okay, but it's few of them. If suddenly Europe came tougher on Russia, there are so many, we will hurt ourselves And so that's on that there is nothing you can do. No country will hurt itself just in the name of some kind of ideological solidarity or something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any more questions in the audience? Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Professor Laruelle and Jean-Yves Camus, yes?
Would you be kind enough to identify yourself?
I'm so sorry. I started talking and thank you. There it is. I'm sorry. I am Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson. I was your moderator. I'm a producer for 60 Minutes during the day, and I do this from time to time at the Carnegie Council, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be amongst all of you. So thank you.
Since the other speaker wasn't able to make it today,
Yes.
I'm just curious to know what is an observatory of political radicals? It sounds like a division of the secret police.
Oh, man. No way.
Guy on the roof with a telescope looking at people with beards and Che Guevara berets.
There's something very specific about the extreme right. Every time scholars decide to have a close look at what the extreme right is, they're always associated with some kind of police. Well, I mean, the extreme right is a legitimate player in European politics. As long as a group does not engage into illegal activity, as long as it does not want to disrupt the democratic process, it's a legitimate player in politics, and it's totally legitimate for scholars to devote most of their time to the study of the National Front and other such parties. I mean, in Europe today, far-right parties, I do not say extreme, but far-right parties or radical right parties are part of the government in Austria, in Norway, in Finland, now in Italy. In Hungary, it's quite a bit different because Mr. Orban's party does not belong to this kind of international coalition of extreme right party. The Hungarian party belongs to the Christian Democratic International, to the Party of European Conservatives. That means that in the European Parliament they sit on the same transnational party with Mrs. Merkel and some of the mainstream conservatives. And that's the same with the Polish Conservative Party, which is now into power. But anyway, after 1945, we used to think that the extreme right was dead because of what happened in Europe. And we only had fringe movements, some of them are undercover or are illegal, and they were never in the mainstream and they never got MPs and so on. No, it's a part of the European political landscape, so it's totally legitimate to devote time and study to the extreme right, and it has nothing to do whatsoever with, I mean, the state has its police and goes about its own business, and I really don't care about that.
It's also because in the French academic system, we tend to use observatory to define a very specialized research center. But that's why it sounds
I don't
like
spend
kind of
my
strange,
day watching at what those
but
people
it
are
means
going
like,
to do.
you know, research center.
Not interested.
And nothing to do,
telescopes.
well, it has to do with telescope in the sense that you are really scrutinizing a very specific research object, but it just means research center, in fact. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Merci.